tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I've been spending a fair bit of time, I realize, on Ontario. Now, again, I did a great interview. I think it was great anyway. Before the break with Jason Kenney, we cover the whole country here. One province I don't cover all that often, admittedly, is Quebec. And part of that is because it's very difficult to find good reporting coming out of Quebec. But one person who's been doing a tremendous amount of that is Marie Oakes with the Westphalian Times, who has been doing what no other English language journalists are in Quebec, with a couple of exceptions. I think Rebel does some great work there and has a small team, but again, hard to compete with the Radio-Canada and the Montreal Gazettes, which are doing a lot of less than stellar reporting on the pandemic. Marie Oakes joins me now. Good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for having me on. And yeah, that was kind of my focus when I even got involved on the internet. That's exactly what I noticed. People were not really looking at what was happening in Quebec, and I was pretty shocked. A lot of it is in the French media, but it doesn't really make its way to English media, whether it be the WE scandal and, all of the happenings in Quebec with that, or like we're going to talk about lockdowns, curfews, those sort of things that most Canadians and even Americans have no idea that's even going on.
Yeah, well, I think that's so key. And I mean, obviously, we don't have time to go through the litany of, reasons that Quebec and the rest of Canada are distinct places. But I know we have seen a little bit of media coverage in the last few weeks about Bill 21, for example, the religious symbols ban, because that had a rearing of its head in the last little while. And I think that underscored that Quebec tends to get away with a lot, in part because you have this political and media culture that tends not to want to confront these issues head on. So you bring that into a lockdown context. Quebec is the only province in the country that has not just imposed a curfew, but has now, as of New Year's Eve, reimposed a curfew. So you can actually be fined just for walking around outside your home in Quebec in the evening.
Yeah, and the thing that's so insane about this is the last curfew is 8 p.m. So a lot of people who are workers, essential workers, they couldn't do their grocery shopping. Most people get off work, say 5 or 6 p.m. Well, most of the grocery stores were closing at 7 p.m., an hour before the curfew was put in place, because they need to get home too, because they don't want to get stopped by police. And it just became really tedious for so many people. And this go around, I think a lot of people are noticing police are less likely to pull you over, less likely to give you as hard of a time, because I think even they are realizing how annoying this is for them to even enforce. I mean, obviously there's going to be those police officers who will be enforcing it. But what I'm hearing from people on the ground is it seems like everyone's changing their tune with this go around with the curfew.
That's actually an interesting point you raised, because I know last time you had Yankee Pollack with Rebel News, who I think was just on a matter of principle just walking around Quebec after curfew every night, and he was reporting what was happening there, and we were seeing that police were being very aggressive, not just with him, but with other people they were encountering. So you're thinking this time, in the first few days this has been on the books, police in Quebec or even Montreal specifically, you think they've pared things down a little bit?
Oh, they definitely have. I mean, of course, there's going to be those city police that, like this ounce of power, feel like it's their duty to enforce this. But we're also seeing they're being a bit more lenient with, say, the other night when there was the curfew protesters. They didn't right away give them a bunch of fines. They waited about 30 minutes to an hour, and then they gave the fines after, telling a few of them, hey, you want to leave or else you're going to get a ticket. And I talked to some people and they said, yeah, I left. I did not want to get that ticket. I made my point. I'm leaving.
So I know it's hard to ascribe motive, but from your conversations or even just your intuition, do you think that police are being deliberately laxer on this because of perhaps not fully buying into it? Or do you think they're concerned about what we're seeing in Europe, what we're seeing in places like Amsterdam, in places like Vienna, where citizens are saying, you know what, we're not taking this anymore, and the protests become a lot more heated?
I mean, that's possible. I wouldn't think a police officer would be really necessarily thinking about that because, like we even discussed, most people in Canada don't even really know what's happening in Quebec. So to really think that people in Quebec exactly know the situation happening in Europe, I don't really think that would be the case. I just think everyone's pretty exhausted. I mean, I'm seeing people on the ground who are pretty, before they were fine with the restrictions, they understood it, really speaking out, not scared of the consequences of them speaking out in their social circles. I'm seeing a lot of young people being pretty upset by this. And the police force, say, in a place like Montreal, is quite young. So I think they're also just fed up at this point, thinking, oh, we have to do this again, because it didn't make the police look super good, because the curfew was, I would say, generally not very popular. But there was just so many people in Quebec being like, even though I don't think the curfew necessarily works, I'm happy that the government is putting at least something in place to make me feel safer.
Would it be fair to say that Quebec has been the most locked down jurisdiction in Canada, except for perhaps, like the Northern Territories, which I know have had some very restrictive measures?
I mean, definitely. I don't think anywhere else has had this curfew. I would say in overall North America in totality, you're seeing so many people in Quebec fleeing Quebec. They're either going to Florida for vacation because they're like, okay, these restrictions may last 4 months, and then come spring, they're going to lift them again. And I am seeing so many people in Quebec move their entire livelihoods, their entire lives to Mexico. I know like a large amount of people who did that the first lockdown, but now even more people this go around.
Well, you did a video not long ago talking about yourself making an exodus from Canada. Explain what led to that.
Well, so I am both Canadian and American, so I don't want to get a bunch of messages asking how I did it. So that's how I was able to leave.
You'll be dispensing immigration advice for the next several weeks now, thanks to that. Okay, she got in the easy way. She had citizenship.
Yeah, because a lot of people do ask me, how did you do it? How did you do it? And unfortunately, I can't give that information. I wish I had more, information of how you can do it as well. But the reason I did it was, with all the border restrictions, it was nearly impossible for my family, who did not have their Canadian citizenship, for them to see me. And it was just so hard for me to also go see them and have to deal with the quarantining process on the way back. I have many animals. I'm an animal lover. I could not logistically figure out how I could be 2-week quarantine, not allowed to leave my house, and own dogs. So it just did not make logistical sense, because there was no exemption for quarantine if you had to walk an animal. And I lived in an apartment, so it was impossible. So at that point, I was like, I miss my family. I do not believe Quebec is ever going to be getting out of these lockdowns. I have been predicting it for over a year now that this was going to happen again. There was going to be another curfew. They were going to be really strong on restrictions, because a lot of people in Quebec do accept these restrictions, and the popularity of the government's extremely high. So I just had a really bad outlook on the situation. And unfortunately, I had a family member in the US become really sick. They had a stroke, and I wouldn't have been able to say goodbye to them. Luckily, they lived through this, but I wanted to spend time with my family. And I think a lot of people feel very similar to me, and that's why they're also getting their entire family out of places like Quebec and other places in Canada, and going to places like Mexico, where they feel like they can live their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought, Mexico would be the bastion of liberty lovers, but I've heard from a few people that have, or more commonly, people that have decided to go down to Florida and Texas. And I'm glad you shared what you did, Marie, because in a lot of cases, people tend to talk about this in ideological terms of, I'm tired of living in an unfree place. I want to go to a free place. You've just described there some very real and very legitimate reasons where you could not live your lives. It wasn't just this moral objection to continuing to live in Quebec, but actually an inability to live your life and interact with your family and your pets the way I think any person should be able to.
Yeah, it was just such a heavy burden on me, because the more and more I lived in Quebec for about, I think, 6 or 7 years, I first was like, oh, I want to get out of here. I don't like it here. And then I really put my roots down in Quebec. I was looking at, possibly buying my first home in St. Adele. I was thinking about staying for the rest of my life. Even though I'm an Anglophone, I was like, okay, I'm going to try and figure this out, even though there was already so many blockades for me to live in Quebec. I'm a type 1 diabetic. Very hard to get in the healthcare system in Quebec for that reason. And the Quebec government really just pushed me out, and so did the federal government with the border restrictions, and even the US government with their also restrictions with Canada. It was just this whole tornado. I thought right now at this time I'd be living the rest of my life in, a more rural part of Quebec, but obviously that didn't happen.
Just out of curiosity here, do you find in Quebec, because you mentioned that people tend to support what's happening, and that I don't think is unique to Quebec. That's been one of the biggest disheartening things I've seen elsewhere. Now, I think the last lockdown might be the exception in Ontario, but a lot of people seem to be willing to go along with this. Do you find there's a language divide where Anglo Quebecers and Franco Quebecers are approaching this differently, or does that not factor into it from what you've seen?
I don't know if that's necessarily a factor. I would say the factor is with the French is only so far as because they are stuck in this ecosystem or this echo chamber of the French media. And the French media in Quebec is really pro-lockdown. There was even a journalist at the last press conference saying, this is the consequences of letting unvaccinated people be allowed to be in Quebec, and asking if they're going to mandate the vaccine for everyone. How that might happen, I don't really know exactly, and asking if they're going to extend the vaccine passport to more places than it already is. So you have a media in Quebec that has no pushback. There's no opposition media, say maybe more so in English speaking part of Canada or the US. So I think a lot of that is the issue with Quebec, and for Francophone speakers is really the only media they have access to is a media that upholds the government rule, doesn't speak against it, is no opposition to the government, is a talking piece for the government, is super pro lockdown, super pro restrictions, where it just becomes really difficult for anyone who is French speaking to break out of that bubble, because all they know is that. And when there has been, this media, this radio show in Quebec City that was speaking out against the government pulled their ads. So they gave them a consequence. Hey, you're speaking out against us. Well, the way you make money is through government ads, like so many media all over Canada. So that's what they'll do in opposition times.
Yeah, very well said. But as I mentioned when we were setting up this interview, even with you having fled Quebec, you still do a better job covering the story of what's happening in Quebec with lockdown than any other English reporters in Canada. And I'd venture to say probably a lot of the French reporters too. I just don't follow their work as much as I probably could. Marie Oakes of the Westphalian Times, an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Thank you, Andrew. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.